Folks, I'm sure you have all noticed that in the last several years there's been a spate of movies about some unknown germ or virus that springs up out of nowhere and just decimates the human race. There's a couple playing in theaters now, and there's one that was just shown on television not too long ago. Of course, we had the Andromeda strain and all kinds of things. Now, for those of you who have been listening to me for quite a long time, I described to you a project called MK Naomi, and I told you about this years ago, wrote about it in my book. That would be used for a Malthusian population decimation scheme. When I was attached to the Office of Naval Intelligence, I learned about Project MK Naomi. And I learned that they were trying to develop a biological agent, a biological warfare agent, which would attack the autoimmune system of the human animal and thereby render production of a vaccine impossible. You see, it doesn't do any good to build up the immune system if what is killing you thrives by eating the immune system. That was the purpose of it. And I documented the legislation in my book where they testified in front of Congress that that's exactly what they wanted to do, and that Congress allotted them millions of dollars to accomplish it. Well, they did. Whatever it is, and however it's caused, and however it works, that's AIDS. In MK Naomi, they were also working on quite a few other biological warfare projects. And we believe that they tested the results of one of them in 1976 in an African country called Zaire. Never before in the history of the world had anybody ever heard of or seen or experienced any disease caused by anything called an Ebola virus. Never. Well, it just sprung up out of nowhere, and wow, what do you know, just by happenstance, there was one of these medical teams on the site. And they went in there and found everybody dead. I mean, everybody. Nobody survived. They quarantined and burned everything and said they brought specimens back to the United States. And then later we saw on television where they brought some monkeys from somewhere, and they found this Ebola virus in the monkeys. Does that sound a little bit similar to the AIDS virus coming from green monkeys? These people are fixated. Now, all of a sudden, guess what's going on? Unbelievable. You see, there was a study made during World War II to determine the impact of the returning soldiers upon the economy. The results, who knows whether they were legitimate or not, the results mobilized a certain segment of the ruling class, the elite, we call them. A second secret study was conducted in 1957 by scientists which met in Huntsville, Alabama. It confirmed the results of the first. What they said to those who ruled the world was that civilization as we know it would collapse shortly after the year 2000 unless the population was seriously curtailed. Was this a legitimate study? I don't know. But I know what they said. The study expressed a concern, folks, that since atomic weapons existed, they would ultimately be used. With the pressure of an expanding population, it made atomic war look inevitable. So using these things as excuses, Congress adopted this armament plan and created the USS Disarmament Agency. Dwight Eisenhower said in 1957, and listen closely to me, quote, "As a result of lowered infant mortality, longer lives, and the accelerating conquest of famine, there is underway a population explosion so incredibly great that in little more than another generation, the population of the world is expected to double, end quote. They then conducted a third study, and this one was done by the Club of Rome. It ended in 1968. The purpose of the study was to determine the limits to growth. The result was the same. The Club of Rome was commissioned to develop a computer model of the world so as to predict the outcome of corrections made to social and economic structures by the elect. The Club of Rome, folks, was also asked to develop a computer model of a new world order. Both of these tasks were accomplished. You can read about it. None of this is hidden. You have the same access to the same information that I have. They did a lot of studies. Some were done to determine a method to arrest the population explosion before the point of what they called no return would be reached. It was determined that an immediate attack on the problem would involve 2 points of intervention, and all of you remember them. The first was to lower the birth rate, and the second was to increase the death rate. To lower the birth rate, they instituted several programs. The first was the development of positive birth control methods using mechanical, diaphragm, and condom, chemical, foam, and birth control pills, and medical, sterilization, abortion, and hysterectomy. And for several years, they were secretly sterilizing people against their will in hospitals in third world nations. All of these were developed, and all of them were implemented. And if you were paying attention, you know exactly when this happened. It was shortly after these studies were finished. They started getting tongue-tied now. They started the women's liberation movement with the demand for free abortions. All of a sudden, an organization called Planned Parenthood sprang up, and abortion clinics began to grow on street corners across the country. They used pro-choice as their rallying cry. They started to encourage homosexuality, and gay liberation was born. You see, homosexuals, folks, don't have children. And some of you older folks will remember that zero population growth became a very hot subject at cocktail parties. But individual freedom, the heat of the moment, the back seat of a nice cherry Chevy at the drive-in, that was the heat of the moment, let me tell you. Religion and the old blue laws sabotaged a lot of these efforts, and while zero population growth became a reality in some areas, population increased rapidly in others. Now, they determined that the only alternative left to them was to increase the death rate. Now, how do you increase a death rate? It's a difficult thing to do. No one wants to pick people out of a crowd and line them up for execution. Neither did anyone relish the possible consequences of an enraged public upon discovering that they were being systematically murdered. Of course, a very short but very deadly global war using nuclear weapons upon select population concentrations was contemplated. And to tell you the truth, it has not been ruled out to this day. And I'm telling you right now, if they can't get their way by any other means, they will create a third world war. The fact that such a population control, ladies and gentlemen, was even contemplated, or can even still be contemplated today, confirmed the worst fears of those who had participated in the first study in 1957. The war's been put on the back burner to simmer, but it could still become a reality. And they would probably blame it upon a bunch of terrorists who set off some atomic weapon in a suitcase in some place like New York City. But in the meantime, something else had to be done that would absolve the decision makers of guilt. and placed the blame on those who did not lead clean lives. Something, ladies and gentlemen, that could be blamed upon Mother Nature. What was it that flashes on the screen at the end of this latest movie about Gaia, however you want to pronounce it? We're chopping down the rainforests, and these strange diseases nobody ever heard of are now coming out of the forest to get even with us for violating Mother Earth. Something like that. They're preparing you. You see, what was needed and what they believe is still needed, ask Prince Charles if you don't believe me, is something like the bubonic plague or some other horrible but natural disease. Now, when I was in the Office of Naval Intelligence, I saw documents that stated that Dr. Aurelio Pacheco of the Club of Rome had made several recommendations that were classified top secret. He advocated that a plague be introduced that would have the same effect as the famous Black Death of history. His recommendation was to develop a microbe which would attack the autoimmune system and thus render the development of a vaccine impossible. And this was just one recommendation. This was done under Project MK Naomi at Fort Detrick, Maryland, as a part of the United States Army biological warfare projects. It was funded by the Congress. In fact, I believe they funded $10 million for this project. It's all in my book, including the documentation. Dr. Aurelio Pacheco wrote this, and you can find it. You can find it, ladies and gentlemen, on page 607 of the Global 2000 report to the President, which was signed by Jimmy Carter. He said, and I quote, "Man has skyrocketed from a defensive position, largely subordinated to nature's alternatives, to a new and dominant one. From it he not only can and does influence everything in the world, but voluntarily or unwittingly can and indeed does determine the alternatives of his own future, and ultimately must choose his options for it. In other words, his novel power condition practically compels him to take up a new regulatory function that willy-nilly he has had to discharge with respect to the world's mixed natural human systems. Having penetrated a number of the erstwhile mysteries and being able to sway events massively, he is now vested with unprecedented, tremendous responsibilities and thrown into the new role of moderator of life on the planet, including his own." End quote. The funding for this project was obtained from the United States Congress under House Bill 15090 in 1969, where $10 million was given to the Department of Defense's 1970 budget. Testimony before the Senate committee revealed that they intended to produce a synthetic biological agent, an agent that does not naturally exist and for which no natural immunity could have been acquired. Within the next 5 to 10 years, it would probably be possible to make a new infective microorganism which could differ in certain important aspects from any known disease-causing organisms. Most important of these is that it might be refractory to the immunological and therapeutic processes upon which we depend to maintain our relative freedom from infectious disease. End quote. Sir Julian Huxley said, "Overpopulation is, in my opinion, the most serious threat to the whole future of our species." The project called MK Naomi was carried out at Fort Detrick, Maryland. You'll find reference to it in several congressional investigations. You'll find reference to it in the research of some very good investigators. But that's about all you'll find. You see, most of the people involved with that project have mysteriously disappeared or died. All of the records are either so highly classified that you'll never see them for the next 100 years or have been destroyed. Can you imagine if the public could have access to the research funded by Congress and conducted under Project MK Naomi to produce synthetic biological agents to control the population of the world? Too far-fetched? Get off your lazy butts and start digging, like I did. And you'll find out that it's not far-fetched at all. You'll find reference to these things and to these discussions and to meetings concerning these issues and to proposals and to implementation of plans ever since the end of World War II.